Thanks so much, Lex. Welcome everyone to our August Stone Living Lab seminar. As I think most of you probably know, the City of Boston has partnered with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to develop a coastal flood protection plan to protect Boston's neighborhoods, economy, people, and infrastructure from sea level rise. After a decade of planning and community engagement through Climate Ready Boston and the Coastal Resilience Solutions plans, a draft report building from that work of the Boston Coastal Storm Risk Management Feasibility Study is now officially open for public comment. Today, we are joined by Kate Roosa, the Senior Climate Resilience Project Manager with the City of Boston, who's the city's point on these efforts. And she will be going over the goals of the study, some of the key projects, and how you can get involved. As usual, this is not just a presentation, but a discussion. So please have your questions ready. Kate will present for about 20-25 minutes, and we're looking forward to lively discussion. And I will hand it over to Kate. Kate, thanks so much for joining.
Oh, Alexis, thank you so much for that introduction. I appreciate it. And I appreciate opportunities like this to be able to amplify the work that we are doing and to also share more about the opportunity we have in front of us for public comment right now. So thank you so much. I'm going to start my timer so I make sure I leave plenty of time for us to have questions. Okay. So as Joe mentioned, I'm Kate Roosa. I'm at the City of Boston Office of Climate Resilience leading this work on behalf of the non-federal sponsor, City of Boston. And Joe gave the great overview that this work is being built upon over a decade of coastal resilient solution planning that the City of Boston has already led to date on this work. And the reason why we partnered with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was when our last project our last coastal resilient solutions study was being completed. We reached out to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to look at how they could potentially help with next steps for funding the work that we identified. So we're both leading from this same shared interest in protecting homes, protecting critical infrastructure and evacuation corridors. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will call this their authorization to mitigate risk to the federal interest. That risk is defined as coastal storm risk under this study. And that also includes relative sea level change, or as we might call it here, sea level rise. So that's included as part of that shared interest for wanting to protect people and critical infrastructure, environmental resources. The place where we might have additional values that we also add to our project work, or another lens that the City of Boston has that goes above and beyond where the federal interest limitations are from the U.S. Army Corps side, is that we know this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to do construction along our coastline. These are dense areas, or these are areas where we have existing projects, we have existing parks, we have existing harbor walk that need to be cared for, and thinking about the opportunity of how we can blend some of our public realm opportunities, integrate more climate justice solutions into our work, places where we need to mitigate other effects from climate change like heat, extreme temperatures, and also thinking about where we also want to be a national leader in being able to implement this work successfully on an urban coastline. So what opportunities we might have above and beyond just that mitigating risk to the federal interest, thinking about what we value and what we want to also take this opportunity to do locally. So is my screen blinking for anyone else? I'm going to pause before I keep going and maybe share another way.
It looks okay. You're on the why now and why a USACE slide still though. Is that correct?
Beautiful.
Yeah, cool.
Yes, no blinking. Great. All right. It's just me and that's okay. I'm having a fun internet day. Thanks for coming along. So the Army Corps has a very specific process that they follow as part of doing their coastal storm risk management feasibility studies. This study that was initiated in 2022, the completion of this study is the first step that unlocks future funding. So it is through seeing this draft report. This is a 10% design deliverable. This is what is currently available to read now today. And our public comment period is open through September 18th. This is our first written deliverable from this study process, and this is the opportunity we have to weigh in on the work that the Corps has done to date. So we initiated this study in 2022. The Corps has been working through their own processes, getting up to speed and creating their own U.S. Army Corps Coastal Hazard System flood map result, which is the image on the left. It might look very familiar to you if you are familiar with the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. But they have spent a lot of time getting up to speed on the decade of planning that the City of Boston has already led, and making sure that they created their own processes that are in accordance with how they have to deliver the results of this study to Congress. And so we had some initial previews of this last year. So if you are tuning in and have participated last year, thank you. If you are new to this process, welcome. You're right on time. No one is late. We are all right on time to be able to participate in this work. And it's critical and vital that you participate in this work and share with a friend. What this draft report is, and I will share the specific link to it, it is the Army Corps quantifying at the national stage what the cost of doing nothing is, or the cost of inaction. And they also recommend the key locations where it would mitigate risks to the federal interest, protect people, protect critical infrastructure, protect homes and environmental resources, to build a coastal flood risk protection measure. They have a toolkit that is basically pricing out a cost for what an approximate tool would be, the locations of how long or how wide one of these tools would have to be, and it's recommending a budgetary cost estimate for what those projects might be. But I want to be clear that this is not the final design. We're not commenting on what the final designs are that the Corps would build in 2 to 10 years from now. We are looking at a 10% out of 100 design deliverable that is more akin to the image, the icon on the left, more of a simplified tool, but it is not the final product of what we would expect to see in our City of Boston coastline, the image at the right. So the Army Corps, because they follow that specific process through their congressional authorization to do this work with us for the city, they are able to sketch out at this point what that typical flood wall section might be, where they would place that flood wall section, but it doesn't necessarily show what we, the City of Boston, would accept as our level of public realm additions to this space. So the image on the left is this is what you will see estimated as part of the overall cost estimate. You will see that the Army Corps can provide up to 65% of the types of tools that they put in that cost estimate. And the non-federal sponsor would be expected to pitch in the remaining 35% of the toolkit on the left. On the right is actually showing the built example of the north end at Langone Park and Popolo Playground that the city has already built. This is already here. And there is a typical flood wall underneath where those benches approximately are. And so what we at the City of Boston, through projects that we have built, like this one, are actively building, like Ryan Playground, and what we are planning to build, like our Resilient Moakley Park, we know that from our decade of work under coastal resilient solutions planning and projects that have progressed further, that we have a level of expectation that's above and beyond what a base toolkit would be. And so for the image on the right, this is what our end goal may look like, and that there is going to be more cost associated with building that end goal, because we know that this is what we would want to see on our coastline. The difference, or the gap that you won't see in the report, is the cost to build that final Langone Park example on the right. you will only see the starting costs for building that base infrastructure on the left. And that comes back to that level of how the mitigating risk to the federal interest will reach a limit of where funding can be maximized. And it will be up to us to understand how we need to come up with additional funding for the public realm opportunities while taking advantage of the big dollar amount that the Corps is offering, proposing to put on the table for us to consider now. So how much total are we looking at? As I mentioned, we're looking at the cost of doing nothing. We're looking at what the cost of projects would be and trying to come up with what would be the benefit to cost ratio for doing that work. And the reason why the Army Corps drills into these national economic dollars is because they have to compare these projects across the country. So they do work nationwide. That means that our City of Boston urban coastline project is going to need to compare apples to apples to a coastal Texas or Mississippi River Valley project. And one of the ways they do that is by making a lot of the economic damages and benefits be on a national economic scale so that they can be compared plan to plan when they get to Congress. So as of the draft report, the Corps has said that if they do nothing, that we could see at least $54 billion in damages before the end of the century if they do nothing, if nothing is built. And so what that means is there is a federal interest in mitigating risk because of the projected damages or loss of value that the national economy could see. So there is a justification to do a federal project in Boston. The projects they have proposed are at least $10 billion total worth of infrastructure, which means we have about $6.5 billion worth of federal match that can be included as part of this project work to get the work done. The $3.5 billion and more is part of what we, the non-federal sponsor, and our property partners, so City of Boston only owns less than 15% of the land along the Boston Harbor, which means we're also going to be looking at partnerships, opportunities, and making efficient use of our public dollars for capital projects that might overlap in the project areas. But we know that there's going to be additional costs for that public realm that we need to build too. With that $10 billion in cost, the Army Corps has found that they can mitigate at least $41 billion in that baseline damage estimate that they estimated citywide if they did nothing. So if I say that another way, for every $1 they spend on building a project, the Army Corps is estimating they could see at least $4 in added benefit through avoided loss, or a benefit to cost ratio of around 4 for the City of Boston, which is strong. We always want to be above a benefit to cost ratio of 1 by 4 or 4 times that. So just to give a zoom out, I highly recommend folks head to our website to be able to zoom in and interact with this map a little bit more, www.boston.gov/flood-prevention, and we'll put that in the chat. This is the over 20 individual projects and 16 miles worth of project locations. It is comprehensive. It is looking at the full coastline and it's looking at neighborhoods, but you'll see a few omissions here. It is not including the new Charles River Dam, so you don't necessarily see projects up the Charles River. And Logan Airport is not surrounded by any work. We've been working closely with our Massport partners, and East Boston Neighborhood Solutions are focusing on all of the other areas because Massport had said they have plans that they are working on and that are already in progress for Logan Airport too. There are other areas where you might be saying, okay, I see some areas of blue and other areas of the coastline. Does that mean there's flooding areas that may not be mitigated as part of these structure locations? Yes. That in our draft report is kind of talking through what is considered residual risk, or the risk that remains after structures are built. Any areas, properties that fall within these still showing up as blue areas or still projected to have flood risk means that these individual properties are all eligible for a non-structural program. These structures, the toolkit structures that the Corps has proposed, are these three icons on the right-hand side of the page. A levee, which is following the Dam and Levee Safety Program through the U.S. Army Corps. Those need a wide width of area to be able to build. Think on the scale of 50 feet plus, whereas the two flood wall features only use around 20 to 30 feet wide of access, which is going to be most of our urban dense coastline where development has already been built out. So these three tools are kind of what you see proposed. The red is that flood wall on land, the blue is the flood wall on water, where the Corps was not confident in the land beneath the surface. They built in the water right next to the land. Where they can, they want to build on land first because that means you're doing less environmental disturbance by having to work in the water. But for areas where we might have, for example, historic granite blocks that you cannot build a new structure on top of that would support coastal flood protection, they had to use some of those flood wall and water tools, which means you're building as close as reasonably possible to the land while still connecting the existing land to that new feature that you build. And so from these tools, you may be wondering, for this group in particular, where did the natural and nature-based features come in? This is from the Army Corps' spectrum of how they talk about natural and nature-based features, the NNBF toolkit. You'll see that in here are the standard nature-based solutions approach. It also includes things like green infrastructure, living shorelines. How can we have soft defenses in addition to this work? Where we are currently landing is after the Army Corps' early assessment of some of our remaining natural features in the Boston Harbor coastal environment. The tools that they have in their natural and nature-based features toolkit for coastal storm risk mitigation may not be conducive to the type of natural systems that we have existing in our harbor. So based on where the flood pathways are, based on the type of beaches that we have do not have barrier beaches, like long stretches of, say coastal Maine, or even moving further south in areas like Virginia, the Carolinas, Texas, Florida, where they have those larger spans of beaches, New Jersey. We have more condensed shorelines that aren't necessarily conducive to a flood protection feature as the Army Corps' first choice toolkit. So I bring up this slide just so that we're all speaking the same language when we talk about the spectrum of how Army Corps talks about natural and nature-based features, and to ask for your consideration that we really focus on how to get our core solutions to this hybrid infrastructure vision. When you go to look at the draft report, you might see more of this type solution, and we're really working with getting creative with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, helping to be a model city. How can we have that urban coastline while integrating more of these natural additional features to help complement the traditional infrastructure that the Corps can offer? We could talk more about that in question and answer, but I just want to have us all talking about the same terms so that we can make sure when we're talking through themes with the Corps, they come up to the same summary level. We're all speaking the same language. I do have more information if folks are interested on background, a little bit more about how the engineering with nature working group within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers within their Engineering Research and Development Center worked with the Belle Isle Marsh Regional Stakeholder Group and looked at how potentially Belle Isle Marsh is one of the last remaining salt marshes in the Boston Harbor coastline, could be maximized for a natural or nature-based feature. They do have a published paper to share more, but the conclusion was similar, where there are opportunities for those hybrid infrastructure components. You may not see those fully designed. You won't see those in the draft report as part of these 10% documents, One of the things we will need public advocacy around is really helping to expand what that might look like, working with the Corps as we go through design processes. So where do we go from here? 3 minutes, okay. We need folks to help us reach out to community members, and we need your stories to be told as part of our public comment. The U.S. Army Corps has a few options open for feedback within the map, within the actual alignments, where they haven't made a final decision for downtown and for South Boston. They have 2 options on the table that we need to weigh in on. They also have made some choices in neighborhoods like East Boston that we may not agree with, and I want us to pay attention to and weigh in on whether we agree with those or not. One of the areas is at Route 1A at Chelsea Creek, where the Corps is looking to do an alignment in the median of Route 1A, and we, the City of Boston, have stated we prefer the Chelsea Creek alignment that is along the waterfront. We want to just do a gut check with you all. What do you think? Something to weigh in on. The other place is at Border Street, where we have a waterside alignment that we're working on with part of our Border Street project that the City of Boston is leading. And the Army Corps is looking at stopping that line of protection inland at New Street. And so it's a question to the community. Is that what you would support, or would you prefer to see that full connected waterside alignment too? Where the study goes from here, we have our public comment period open to September 18th. We need your help with getting your own story captured, with your organization, if you represent an organization's comments captured, and sharing with your neighbors, anyone who uses the T, anyone who uses Logan International Airport, anyone who enjoys all of the amenities and opportunities that Boston has to offer. That qualifies you to comment. You do not need to live in Boston. You do not need to work in Boston. If you have any experiences that shed light onto the regional systems, then that qualifies you to be able to comment. We then will work on the draft to final plan over the course of 2027, including developing a schedule of what timelines some of these projects may be able to be implemented on. If you pop into the draft report, you won't see a project schedule with all of the projects outlined on construction funding. The goal of this public comment is to start with getting community buy-in, community feedback on the project locations first, and that we will have opportunities over the next year to have more community engagement, such as through webinars and groups like Stone Living Lab, to be able to get the word out about how we are planning to draft some of our implementation and schedule planning. We then go to Congress in 2028, and that's when we're going to get Congress to authorize our city plan, and then we will have decades of work to be done. We do not receive that $10 billion match of $6.5 billion up front. This will take us many years to be able to get these projects implemented. We have over 20. You can't do 16 miles of construction along the Boston waterfront all at once. We're going to be thinking strategically about how we phase these. So I did mention some links. I will put these in the chat so you all have them, but we have 3 ways you can provide public comment, which is through our online form. I will paste that in the chat. And you can also email the Army Corps team. You can submit comments in writing. We also have a website that is available with other ways to hear this information. We know that the report is a very large report and not everyone may have time to read it. We made some quicker examples, visual examples, if you're a visual learner like I am, to be able to interact and understand more about how this study works. I'm going to just also from the slide pop this in the chat so everyone has it. This is the website where you can find all of the resources that were just visualized on the previous slide. So you can find more there. But thank you all so much. I look forward to answering your questions. And I'm going to stop sharing, but if we need to, I'm happy to bring up the slides as a visual in case we need to go back to them.
Kate, thank you so much. That was fantastic. We really appreciate you joining today. Appreciate the work that you and your colleagues at the city are leading. This is just such a huge effort, and and so important for the city's future and the future of residents and nature and the region as a whole. So yeah, much appreciated. And both the Stone Living Lab and Boston Harbor Now have been happy to be partnering with you all along the way on this and sort of advising in the early steps, going back several years to now we're trying to amplify the efforts through our education and engagement work, as well as through sessions like today. And please just call on us as needed and continue to. So I want to get to Q&A. I think we probably have a lot of good questions here, and if folks want to maybe raise their hands using the raise hand function, which is under that React menu. But I see a couple in the chat that I'll start reading. Kate, the first one is from Phil, and he was questioning about the $58 billion of damages. Really, to what exactly was his question?
Good to see you, Phil. Great question. The $54 billion in damages is to the national economy through private property, public property damage, public infrastructure damage, and home losses. So it's a summary of a lot of different factors, but it is absolutely including effects over private and public property. And that $54 billion in damages is projected through the end of this century, so through 2090, and it's looking at really what would be the cost of doing nothing, and it would be at least $54 billion. And it could be more than that. We know that the Corps doesn't capture things like loss to tourism industries. We know that they might be missing costs when it comes to some of our more regional costs that we might incur too. What would happen in New England specifically, not just to the nation. So I usually like to caution that is at least $54 billion in damages. There could be a lot more. We know other studies have shown that there is more potential if we do nothing. Hope that helps, Phil.
Thanks so much, Kate. Phil had a second note in the chat that was on the sort of border of a question and comment, but he said that one has to assume that the Corps will allow permitting to fill harbor edges if the city chooses to do more. What were your thoughts on that? Certainly a topic that's interesting here at the lab, given the legislative work we're always collaborating on.
Yeah, to your point, Phil, this is actually another interesting piece where the Corps is responsible when we go to do the projects. Let's assume we get authorized in Congress. We can hit go on being able to work through designing for the next phase some of these individual projects. But you raise a good flag, which is the Corps, the Army Corps of Engineers, is responsible for doing the federal permitting as the equal half in the partnership. Let's pretend it's a project that's very clearly a City of Boston as non-federal sponsor. The Corps is working to design. The Corps will be responsible for filling out federal permits, but we, the non-federal sponsor, will need to fill out state and local permits. And so where we here in the Commonwealth have our Chapter 91 waterfront protections and where we have our existing regulations that are in place that we would need to be compliant with, you raise almost a way that I'm going to ask this as a question, which is how would Phil be considered as part of these project works, especially maybe where the Army Corps of Engineers has selected a tool that requires some fill in the water, like for a flood wall in water. And this is an opportunity where I am not assuming anything at this moment, because if we were to look at our existing, we still have to be able to design a project that needs to be built in the Commonwealth. The Army Corps of Engineers has to be able to provide us, the non-federal sponsor, with a design that to the maximum extent practical is able to meet the local and state regulations. So in today's environment, this is one where that is not necessarily guaranteed, where it may be a federal project, the work is still being built here in the Commonwealth, and we will still need to follow our existing state and local laws and regulations to do this work. So this is one area too, where you're absolutely right. I'll flag this as also our state regulators are at the same time as all of us, if they're not already in the call or maybe have already started their review, looking at this draft report for the first time in whole too. And so we're looking forward to being able to see what some of our agencies might be concerned about, have questions about, or want to raise flags for the Corps, specifically as it speaks to some of the things we might consider before we go to implement this work in Boston, things we might need to think about as we refine our toolkit, because these are 10% designs. That means we have 90% of our design to go. And so there might be some changes to what that design looks like based on feedback that we're able to get from our regulatory entities. So I appreciate you raising that, Bill. It's a great flag.
Thanks so much, Kate. And not seeing any hands yet, I'm going to go to one more question from the chat from Brad Washburn at Massport, who asks, has anyone brought up the potential for an extension to the public comment period?
Brad, thank you for that question. You're not alone. I think back earlier in the year when the schedule for this project release started to flesh out, that was the first question I asked was, summer's a really hard time to get public engagement. Folks are enjoying the waterfront, which is the expectation. But as of right now, we don't have time in our schedule to be able to meet from what the Corps has been able to timeline for us, being able to extend the public comment while still being able to meet our 2028 final deliverable date. We go to Congress in early 2028, so think first quarter. That means we have less than a year to get our final report done to be able to get to Congress. And so the U.S. Army Corps is not able to extend this draft public comment period. The opportunity I will raise is that when we get to our final draft report, it will be our final report. There will still be a draft of it. The goal is to start exploring what our sidecar MEPA or Massachusetts Environmental Protection Act process will look like, and that there will be hopefully another opportunity for us to have a second public comment period that will be at the state level for this work. So that's currently the draft plan as we work through working with the MEPA folks, working to put a timeline together on how we can begin to get the state MEPA certificate process for this work going. And as we all know, that is a protected public comment period under our current state laws. So no, don't expect an extension for the federal. Mark your calendar, September 18th, do your best. Be on the lookout because we will still have a MEPA process as part of this down the road, which will have another public comment period too. So it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to get submitted. We have resources on the city website for just how to give a quick version of your story, your storytelling. And I really appreciate all of you who work with agencies. I know this is a big ask, especially for mid-September, but I really appreciate folks being able to get together early to put comments together. Great flag.
Thanks so much, Kate. Going to go to one more from the chat here from Kenneth, and who asks, to piggyback on that, does the Corps bypass NFIP ordinances, associated costs associated to those plans? Are those costs absorbed by them in the 10 billion estimate provided?
That's a great question, Kenneth. Thank you for raising it. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is considered the engineer for the nation. And during an emergency response, they are the engineer for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. But during a non-emergency, they are in separate cabinets at the federal level. And so what I was surprised to learn was when they're doing project coordination work or when FEMA has projects that are proceeding under their grant programs or the Army Corps is doing programs through their process, that they really do keep to themselves when it comes to the regulations and the process for how they do their work. So I say all of this because there's still learning here that we're going to do as we start to develop our projects out. But to keep it high level, the Army Corps doesn't necessarily bypass any ordinances under the National Flood Insurance Protection Program. They do ask the non-federal sponsor, when you go to do projects, that we, the non-federal sponsor, are then responsible for doing a letter of map revision once a project is done. So the U.S. Army Corps may not automatically update the FEMA flood maps when they're done with a project. They are typically asking that that is the responsibility of the non-federal sponsor. But to your second question, are those costs absorbed in the $10 billion estimate? One way to think of this is the U.S. Army Corps, in where they cite their projects and where they want to close those district scale flood pathways, the goal is to reduce the amount of flooding that is occurring in a given area by closing where that flood water can enter. So following with a typical, or what a standard process would follow, Army Corps comes in, they build the project that was proposed with learning information along the way, and the non-federal sponsor at the end says to FEMA, we submit to you that we built this project and we think it changed the level of risk that this community sees. FEMA, through their National Flood Insurance Program, then goes through the process of that, receiving that letter of map revision, approving it, redrawing the map. So that's usually what I would call the simplified, I'm oversimplifying it, standard practice might look like. So are the costs absorbed by them in the $10 billion estimate provided? I would say mostly, because the $6.5 billion match is going to be 65% of that $10 billion. So 65% of the actual building of the infrastructure would be absorbed in that Army Corps cost estimate. But the actual cost for being able to prepare the letter of map revision to go through a process with FEMA likely isn't. That's going to fall to the non-federal sponsor. That might be able to be included as part of the eligible 35% match, but there's also a good chance that that would be an in addition cost. It will be smaller magnitude. It will not be on the scale of billions of dollars. That would likely be on a project by project basis. And it would likely not even scratch $1 million. It'll depend. So that'll be project specific. I hope that helps kind of.
That's great, Kate. Thank you. Thank you for the great question, Kenneth. Not seeing any hands, I'm going to jump to one of mine, Kate. And you have a lot of great partners represented on the call here. And I think a general question I had that we had heard on a call we were both on this morning too, is sort of when our organizations are engaging with members of the public, is volume of comments helpful here? Meaning, should we be encouraging individuals who care to be submitting their own letters in addition to the letters that we're submitting through our organization? So is volume important here?
It is. Thank you for raising that, Joe. It is, because our organizations absolutely have a great service and a great viewpoint of how they can bring together a collective to comment, and the power that that brings as a shared voice. Yes, individuals also, because of your lived experience and the storytelling and the perspective you bring, as a resident, as someone who is a rider of the T, who rides the ferry into work from the community of Hull every day for work. And so you can be outside of the city of Boston or live in the city of Boston and know that the option of doing nothing or the option of doing something is what the Corps needs your feedback on now. So yes, please. It doesn't have to be a full formal letter. We've made the process accessible where it can be you spend 15 minutes to fill in a form, you spend 5 minutes to be able to fill in the form. We do want to see as many folks as we can engage to build the collective support that we have as individuals and as organizations, and demonstrate to the Corps that we're ready to roll up our sleeves and keep going.
That's awesome, Kate. Thanks so much. Paul, I didn't want to call you out. I could tell you had your thinking face on, so I was going to call on you even before you raised your hand, but glad to see your hand up. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Joe. And Kate, thank you very much for this presentation. and also for excellent management of a very complex study. Um, as you may know, I was the leader of the team that in 2018 recommended against a harbor-wide barrier and recommended it for a shore-based approach, green as possible, which you actually showed in your introduction slide. So I cannot help but be curious about, did the Corps ever look at a harbor-wide barrier as alternative for this approach for this flood management?
Thank you for that question, Paul, and thank you for the service and the expertise that you provided in that study and continue to provide for our waterfront work, and especially Boston Harbor community. The U.S. Army Corps did receive that study. They did include a very small little couple of sentences, a light paragraph in the overall chapter 2 of the draft report, acknowledging that there was a local study done that looked at harbor-wide barrier approaches, both outer and inner. And the Corps read that and agreed. And that was why we went through our study, we looked at our alternatives and did our own process, but ultimately agreed with what those study findings had recommended. And we also agree that other than our Fort Point storm surge barrier, a single project application where a barrier is proposed, they overall agreed. I might argue that we might want to see more from just they read the report and maybe have a little more. I know that they read the report. I know that they considered a lot of the findings. I don't know if they, in the report, reflected that to the magnitude of time they took. But yes, they did review that report and found similarly that it's not out of the question for Boston Harbor after this century, that they would see this as more of a long-term beyond 2100, year 2100 project that they might have to come back to. So that was where that conclusion had left. I would be curious to know, especially from this community and kind of reading through with a more detailed read of chapter 2, whether you got that sense from them. And if you didn't, that might be a level of place where you might ask to have more accountability from them on reflecting that more accurately too.
Okay. When you're referring to chapter 2, I'm looking at the website right now. This is the report of the Boston Coastal Storm Risk Management Study. Is that the chapter 2 in that report? Or is it another, because there's a lot of appendices. Is that the right chapter 2 we should be looking at?
Yep. If you go to the draft integrated feasibility report and programmatic environmental assessment, I'll share my screen so y'all can see it. On the city website, you're going to be going to this third link here. I'm also going to just click because I see that the U.S. Army Corps page, so you'll know because it's their castle logo. They also, over here, report, I think they ended up, yeah, there they went. So they actually separated out the intro chapters as 1 through 4. So you could actually click on this, and it will just bring you to chapters 1 through 4.
Okay. Well,
And
I'm
I'm
glad we
gonna,
all agree.
just while
I'm
I'm
glad we
here,
all agreed. Thank you.
Great question, Paul, and thanks for sharing that insight and then also guiding us on access here, Kate. I see Kristen has a good question in the chat. Kristen, if you want to ask that, please unmute. Otherwise, I'm happy to read it as I did with others.
Yeah, no, happy to ask this. And Kate, thanks for this presentation. It's really great and a good reminder to jump into the report and actually look at it. I guess my question was really, you identified a couple of places where maybe the city does not agree with what the Army Corps has proposed. I'm just curious, what happens if a project that the Army Corps wants to move forward with is in opposition to something that the city wants? How does that get reconciled? Does it just not move forward? How does that work?
yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question, Kristen. So at this point, looking at collectively our 20 projects, the city preferred alternative overlaps with over 80% of them. So we're talking about a smaller number of projects, specific example locations, where we have two options on the table right now. For places like the North End, Downtown, and Wharf District, where there are two alternatives on the table, we, the city, have expressed already to the Corps our preferred is a full waterside alignment that goes all the way from Battery and Burroughs Wharf to the Fort Point Channel. And we've already weighed in. When the Army Corps has their internal decision where they take in community engagement feedback, they kind of see where opinions of the larger community, they're absolutely hearing us as non-federal sponsor, but they're also waiting to hear from you all if you have a preferred alternative where the choices are on the table. So downtown is one. South Boston is the other, namely in Seaport, where there's an alternative that includes Rayflin Marine Park, and the other alternative excludes Rayflin Marine Park. And the city has said we prefer to include Rayflin Marine Park because of the economic value to the region and to the city that that area will provide. The next decision point, the off-ramp, would be we have an option known as a locally preferred plan that we, the city, as the non-federal sponsor, can use if the conclusion from community feedback or from the Corps concludes that based on X, Y, or Z factor, that might be a cost factor, that might be a life loss factor, it's likely going to be a cost factor. It's likely going to be, this might be too expensive for us to build when we could build the less expensive option and still mitigate risks to the federal interest. We can employ what a locally preferred plan option would be, which means that particular project hits pause. We, the non-federal sponsor, go back to Army Corps headquarters and have to justify directly to headquarters at Army Corps why this is the locally preferred option and demonstrate what that regional economic benefit is. We have more homework to do if we don't align. So our goal, of course, is where we have our shared goals and interests to try to get our plan as close to that shared preferred plan as we can. But we also have off-ramps through our locally preferred plan process in the event that the Corps ultimately disagrees with what they hear from the community and from the city.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
To say it, to add to that too, before I forget, is there's the Army Corps of Engineers would likely not do a project anyway if the community, state, and city where they would be doing the project didn't support it. Those projects still require the non-federal sponsor to do a lot of that work. So if we don't support it, it wouldn't move forward in its current form. To kind of answer more directly your second question.
That's a great clarification, Kate. Appreciate that. And thank you for the good question, Kristen. I think we have time for one more question. So we're going to go to Amy. Amy, you're up.
Great. Thanks, Joe. And maybe a caveat to my question is I had to come in about 10 minutes late, so you may have answered this, in which case someone else can jump in. I'm just curious, I participated in and I know I'm aware of the city's kind of extensive efforts in the Climate Ready Boston work and the different neighborhood plans that have been done over the last, 6 to 8 years, something like that at this point. And so I'm wondering if you could just speak to how you think about this relative to those, and maybe how the community might understand kind of all the things they've heard over the last little while in those design and planning projects versus what they're hearing now and what that might mean in implementation for them.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually the perfect way to kind of close context too, Amy. So thank you for asking that. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers partnership really started because we'd already spent around a decade, now we're absolutely a decade in, of those coastal resilient solutions plans. So from the City of Boston perspective, we are treating our coastal resilient solutions plans as the foundation because we spent that time together with the community, with stakeholders, to develop those plans, to understand the neighborhood impacts on the hyperlocal level, and to really be the first ones to the table for the background of the climate science that stands behind a lot of those design flood elevations or potential design flood elevations. And looking at those time horizons, those plans were all made on the near term 2030 timeframe, 2050, and long term or 2070 time basis. So when the U.S. Army Corps, like when our last report was done in 2022 is when we went back to the Corps and said, we did these studies. How can you plug into the study work we've already done and help us fund the next steps to get to design and construction of these projects? And the Corps said, wow, yeah, we appreciate all of the work that you guys have done, and we will still need to get up to speed with our own processes because we have regulatory and guideline procedures on how we do these studies with communities. But we absolutely want to start with what the basis is that you have already laid and the foundation you've built in the community to help understand what folks have already said they want to see and what they don't want to see. And so the Corps, like my oversimplification is if you treat the Army Corps processes as like a box with a hand crank on it, that this draft report is really the Army Corps putting in their parallel process, them putting in the Climate Ready Boston or Coastal Resilient Solutions reports, running it through what kind of process they can have for the federal interest risk mitigation side. And what you're seeing is really a draft of, okay, we Army Corps within our authorization to mitigate risk to the federal interest cannot necessarily design within our cost estimates the full public realm opportunities that you all have presented through Coastal Resilient Solutions. But we can provide you with some base infrastructure that will provide the storm risk protection, and that you all, City of Boston and beyond, can still invest in public realm improvements, investments, additional projects that will help pilot innovative nature-based solutions for an urban coastline that the Corps has not seen on a scale enacted to date. You can do all of that more, but our federal interest limit is for that fundamental coastal infrastructure and up to 65% of it. So where we envision is thinking of our return to foundation. And as you move up, this process might feel like you're going in circles, but it's more of a spiral staircase where we're adding new information and we're going up levels together. When you look at it from the top, it looks like we're going in circles, but I promise our shared goal is still to get to construction, operation of these projects. This is what the Corps' output version first draft is of what their ability to deliver as much of our Coastal Resilient Solutions projects that they can within their authorization. So we're still looking to bring forward. We know that there are gaps because this isn't a final design. We know that we are going to need to invest in addition to our $3.5 billion match, the funding that it will take to close the gap of where base infrastructure alone won't be what our communities need. And that's where we're also working with partners like the Green Ribbon Commission right now to look at what financial opportunities we have for both our non-federal sponsor match, but also capacity to use other mechanisms to raise that additional funding. So the $10 billion price tag is the start, not the end. And we know that there's a funding gap in addition to the 3.5 match that we would need for the Corps to be able to fulfill what that Coastal Resilient Solutions vision is. And the intent too that those Coastal Resilient Solutions reports set up was the community-led input during design that we, the City of Boston, would seek to continue as part of our work moving forward, because that's been one of the, if not the most important parts of where the Coastal Resilient Solutions reports left off. And so that's one thing too that we know we're going to be continuing as projects come up. We know that there's going to need to be additional community conversations with as we get forward in design. But because of the Army Corps process, we have to start with this 10% design, this 10% budgetary ask that goes to Congress in 2028 so that we can be given the authorization to fund those subsequent design discussions on how we can bridge that gap specifically to fulfill a climate ready Boston foundational vision or to update it based on how community needs have changed too. I know that was also, you have to bear with my long-windedness, but I hope that helps to kind of close that of where these projects really go from here. We're bringing them with us. We can't leave them behind. They're in the suitcase.
Great, thank you.
Great question, Amy, and great response, Kate. Thank you so much. And sorry to be joining from my phone now. Bumped into a little bit of a tech issue on my computer, but just in time to close us out. So I think that Lex has a slide to share here. Just a quick thank you. And yeah, just want to say a big thank you to Kate for joining us and for all the hard work. And thank you to everybody for attending and all the great questions. Please look forward to our next seminar on September 17th and see you all soon. Thanks again, everyone.